What really causes hamstring strains and lumbar disc injuries? Yesterday in clinic, I saw 3 pulled hamstrings. 3. It's not an uncommon injury, but it's not that common either. I might typically go months without seeing a single one. Whenever that kind of coincidence shows up in my life, I figure it's the universe trying to get my attention, and I've learned it's generally a good idea to listen. So today we're going to talk about hamstrings, and by extension, the superficial back line. It's impossible to really understand hamstring function without considering their role as part of this essential structure. This is of particular importance to chiropractors, as the superficial back line completely encompasses the spine from top to bottom. We talked in detail about how the deep front line and the lateral line both insert into the plantar surface of the foot and play a role in lifting the arches. But the superficial back line is the plantar surface of the foot. This fascial line begins at the tips of the toes and runs through the plantar fascia, through the Achilles tendon, calves and hamstrings, into the sacrotuberous ligament, through the sacral fascia, up along the entire length of the spine, and then over the top of the head to ultimately insert on the supraorbital ridge. On a fascial level, it literally is the foot-brain connection. Remember, these fascial lines are the body's force transfer mechanism. In the case of the superficial back line, this is how we transfer forward propulsive force from the ground when we're walking or running. In the running world, they refer to this mechanism as the triple extension. In order to propel ourselves forwards, we first extend our hallux, then our knee, then our hip. And the hamstrings are the bridge that transfers this force from the legs to the body. And they have a tricky role to play in this process, as they're both an extensor of the hip and a flexor of the knee. This means that at the same time as we move forward, they're accelerating the hip into extension, which is a concentric contraction, but at the same time decelerating the extension of the knee, which is an eccentric contraction. So this really requires some neurological finesse. And the brain can only accomplish this through precisely tuned feedback mechanisms. One fascinating fact that I learned recently: did you know that only 20% of muscle fibres span the entire length of some muscles? The other 80% insert into fascial elements along the length of the muscle. So this is the line between muscle and fascia begins to blur. It's just not as black and white as we learned in our training or as we see in the anatomy books. Fascia is not just a sheath around the muscle or a compartment around a bunch of muscles. It interpenetrates and interdigitates with every element of the muscle, sometimes not just encasing the muscle, but encasing each individual muscle fiber. And our fascial web contains 250 million nerve endings. That's 6 to 10 times more than muscle tissue. And this includes not just mechanoreceptors and nociceptors, but also thermoreceptors, chemoreceptors, autonomic nerve endings involved in emotional regulation. It's all embedded in the fascia. This is why it's been said that the brain listens to fascia and talks to muscles. In the case of the 3 hamstring strains I saw yesterday, one was a sprinter, one was a softballer, and one was a hockey player. Basically, all 3 injuries were running injuries. They all occurred when the athlete required explosive power and acceleration. All 3 of them were fit, healthy individuals, and all 3 were warmed up. In all cases, the injury occurred well into the game or training session. In each case, there was no external force involved. They didn't get tackled, they weren't powerlifting a heavy weight. So what went wrong? None of these were force overload issues. They occurred as a result of either force miscalculation or force mismanagement. This is what causes the vast majority of hamstring strains. I also saw a classic lumbar disc case yesterday. It was a young mum named Annie who shuffled very carefully into my office. And when I asked her what happened, she said, "I just bent down to pick up a water bottle out of a school bag, and suddenly my lower back spasmed so badly that I couldn't get up. And the next day it was so painful I couldn't even get out of bed." When I tested her, my testing indicated a left L4 posterolateral disc injury. This is the same mechanism of injury as the hamstring strains. It's just a different tissue that failed. Again, there was no excessive force. It's not like the water bottle was heavy, but the force was either mismanaged or miscalculated. And that has everything to do with the function of the superficial back line and its beginnings on the feet. You might remember in our recent episode on posture, we discovered how every motor neuron has up to 10,000 sensory inputs. It's the total summation of all of these inputs across thousands of neurons innervating each muscle that drives motor output. There's a link below if you missed it. Now, force miscalculation is really a sensory issue. When we experience a force miscalculation problem, it's because the sum total of all of those sensory inputs added up to an incorrect motor output. These kind of injuries, when there's no outside force involved, have been described as motor control errors. But remember, afferent always precedes efferent. It's really a sensory issue. In simple terms, the body created an inappropriate motor response based on bad information. And when it comes to lumbar disc injuries and hamstring injuries, one of the most common sources of bad information is the feet. As we know, the plantar surface of the feet is one of the most receptor-dense areas of the body, second only to the head, neck, and jaw. The smallest, most sensitive nerve branches in the entire peripheral nervous system are found in the feet. This brings us back to one of our central concepts, that modern shoes and featureless modern surfaces are effectively blindfolding the brain and severely dampening one of our most vital sensory inputs. When we can't accurately sense the ground, the entire force transmission mechanism of the superficial backline is thrown off, and hamstring strains and lumbar disc injuries are a common consequence. This also sets up our other common cause of injury, which is force mismanagement. This one's really a motor issue. Force mismanagement injuries occur when a force is not appropriately absorbed or transmitted to the next link in the kinetic chain. This is where hamstring strains and lumbar disc injuries are really just two sides of the same coin. It's just the location of the weak link in the chain that's different. Again, the function of the superficial backline is critical here. And again, it starts on the feet. As we approach toe off during the stance phase of gait, our hallux is extending and our foot is plantar flexing. Our weight is moving over the forefoot, which spreads out our metatarsals and creates forefoot splay. This stretches and tightens a thick band of fascia that runs transversely under our metatarsal heads, called the plantar plate. This in turn then tightens the plantar fascia, absorbing ground reaction forces and elastically storing them in our tissues. They're then transmitted up the kinetic chain through the Achilles tendon, the calves and hamstrings, and into the pelvis and spine. The whole thing begins with that splaying of the metatarsals. This acts like the ignition switch for the entire posterior change. I believe this is one of the strongest arguments for wearing barefoot shoes, or at least shoes with a wide toe box that allows for natural forefoot splay. When that doesn't occur, the function of the entire superficial backline is compromised, and injury is a common result. The reality is, hardly any modern shoes accommodate for this. One obvious reason hamstring injuries occur and are more common during sports is the greater forces involved. We know that force equals mass times acceleration, so sports involving rapid acceleration, like sprinting or softball or hockey, are more likely to create hamstring strains. However, I think there's another widely overlooked reason. In each of these sports, players are usually wearing narrow, restrictive footwear, which restricts their forefoot splay. So the posterior chain ignition switch just never fires. This could explain the many cases that I've seen, especially watching soccer or rugby over the years, where a player just jogs onto the field and pulls a hamstring before they even get anywhere near the action. In these cases, it's not an acceleration issue. It's a force mismanagement issue. When the plantar plate and plantar fascia are not appropriately tensioned, it introduces slack into the system. And tensegrity-based systems, like the human fascial system, rely on balanced tension to maintain their integrity and spread force evenly. Slack in a tensegrity system causes focal points of increased load, and this is where the injury usually occurs. Hamstrings and lumbar discs are common locations, but it could also be a calf strain or an injury anywhere throughout the spine. Neck strains are pretty common as well. How commonly do you think you might be seeing this mechanism playing out daily in your practice? I had a personal experience of this last year. I was doing some heavy calf raises when suddenly I felt a sharp twang in my mid-thoracic area, just below my left scapula. Nothing super major, but painful, right? Enough to end my workout, and in fact to prevent me working out for the next couple of weeks. I was pretty sore. What fascinated me was the location of the injury. My calves were doing all the heavy lifting, but the focal stress point that blew out was in my thoracic spine. That's tensegrity and the superficial back line in action. It was force mismanagement, and in my case, the weak link was in my thoracic spine. As chiropractors, we're working on the spine all day long, but often without considering this wider interaction with the superficial back line and the way it transmits force from the feet to the head and back again. It means that the cause of a subluxation or muscle injury may not originate in the local area where the pain is. That spot just happens to be the weak link in the fascial force transmission chain. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't treat that area, but it does mean that it might also be worth considering the rest of the system, particularly the top and the bottom. With my hamstring and lumbar disc patients, I'm typically addressing their cervical spine, their lumbar spine, their pelvis, and their feet. All of them are usually involved. So here's how you can check this in your practice. One way you could practically implement these ideas is by checking the reflex point that I've found associated with the superficial backline. You can find it just lateral to the right PSIS. It's usually quite palpable as a tight, tender spot. If you give it a firm rub, most patients will jump, and they'll be quite surprised how sensitive it is. If you compare it to the same spot on the left, there'll be a noticeable difference. I suspect if you were to check this on every patient tomorrow, you wouldn't find a single one where it isn't significantly tender. That's how common superficial backline issues are. If you give it a firm rub for about 30 to 60 seconds after you're done with your prone spinal adjusting, it'll help patients integrate and hold their corrections better. They'll also get off the table feeling better immediately. It's a perfect opportunity for a brief conversation with the patient about what that tender spot means. I tell them, this is a reflex point for your superficial backline, which is a fascial line that runs from the soles of your feet all the way up your spine and over the top of your head. The fact that it's so tender indicates that your feet might be a factor in your back, your neck, your spine, your headaches, whatever their symptom might be. Tenderness of this reflex point is a good indication that this patient would likely benefit from wearing better balance orthotics. This doesn't have to interrupt your adjusting flow. The conversation can be as simple as, hey, next time I see you, we're going to do a quick test to see if your feet are affecting your spine. Or even, let's get you scheduled with Caitlin, our tech CA, for a quick test to see if your feet are affecting your spine. Of course, if it suits your style of practice, it's even better to get them assessed right away, while the sensitivity at that spot and what it means are fresh in their mind. I find it really helps patients understand the holistic, whole body nature of the work we do. So that's 4 individual cases, 1 single mechanism of injury. I guarantee you see this in your practice every day, multiple times a day. Hopefully this gives you a simple, implementable tool to start seeing some missing links and a powerful treatment strategy to improve your outcomes. Love to hear what you find. Just let me know in the comments below. Thanks. Have a great week.